Welcome friends to this second lecture of week 8, and in this module 8 we are talking about different soil pollutants. In the first lecture we have talked about some important soil pollutants, inorganic soil pollutants. We have talked about nitrogen, different forms of nitrogen, and also we discussed the nitrogen cycle. We also discussed the phosphorus and major phosphorus forms and how they get fixed depending on different pH and what are their forms which are present at different pH levels. And then we have talked about the eutrophication, which is a nutrient enrichment based pollution process, and what are the causes of eutrophication. And then we have talked about the what are the ill effects and effects of eutrophication. And then we have talked about the salts, what are the different types of salts which are present, and we started with the sulfur. Among different elements we start with the sulfur. So, in the last lecture we have talked about the different sulfur containing compounds which are present in the soil organic matter, and then we will start from here. And in this lecture we will be talking about some more elements which are important soil pollutant. So, let us start with the sulfur containing compounds in the soil organic matter. We know that they are mainly amino acid cysteines, and then methionine, reducible sulfur, ester sulfate, carbon bonded sulfur, and also different related compounds to carbon bonded sulfur. So, you can see this is a structure of the cysteine, and the release of sulfur depends on the rate of decomposition of organic matter in the soil. So, the organic matter decomposition rate controls the release of sulfur from this organic bounded form, and the release of after the release, this sulfur is oxidized to sulfate by sulfur oxidizing microorganisms. There are both sulfur oxidizing microorganisms and sulfur reducing microorganisms. So, sulfur oxidizing microorganism basically oxidize the sulfur to produce the sulfate, okay, and this sulfate is more available to the plant. Now, what are the atmospheric sources of sulfur? Sulfur is primarily found in sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, and the quantity of the sulfur dioxide in the air is mostly high in the urban areas where different power stations and industries are situated. So, basically the sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere basically generates through industries as well as automobile emission. Now, these gases are dissolved in rainwater and causes the acidification. As you can see in this picture, this sulfur dioxide along with the nitrous oxide, due to the industrial process, they goes to the soil, goes to the atmosphere, and then they react with the water vapor which is present in the atmosphere, and ultimately returns back to the earth in the form of either nitric acid or sulfuric acid. So, the acid rains again increase the acidity of the soil. However, luckily this acidic rain problem is a local problem, it is not a very pervasive problem. Now, other sources, what are the other sources of sulfur? Now, other sources of sulfur is irrigation. When we irrigate with the saline water, that could be a source of sulfur. Then rise in the drainage water water sulfate levels. So, that could be one of the source of sulfur, and also use of calcium sulfate for soil reclamation could be one of the source of sulfur. Now, we apply gypsum to reduce the soil pH. So, that gypsum application can also increase the sulfur in the soil. Now, let us see the sulfur cycle. So, this sulfur cycle shows that how sulfur converts into the soil environment. So, let us start with the crop. So, the crop basically takes the sulfate which is present in the soil solution, and then sulfate is sulfate is uptaken by the plant, and this plant when after their death, this plant residues basically enrich the organic sulfur. This organic sulfur helps in the mineralization to the sulfate form, and this sulfate is further goes towards the organic sulfur through the immobilization process, and also this sulfate get absorbed getting the converted to the adsorbed form or mineral sulfur, and from there also there is some dissolution of this mineral sulfur to the sulphate form. Okay. And also due to the weathering of different minerals, due to the weathering of different weathering process, there is formation of the sulphate. Atmospheric deposition, I have already talked about the acidic rain in the previous slide. So, that atmospheric deposition can contribute some sulphate. Okay. So, when we apply the mineral fertilizer, it can produce either elemental sulfur or it can produce the sulphate. Okay. Now, this elemental sulfur, when they goes oxidation through different processes, they produce the sulphate, and also this oxidation occurs through different sulfur oxidizing bacteria. And from the sulfur, due to the reduction, due to the anaerobic condition, it produce bacterial reduction occurs and ultimately produce the reduced sulfur H2S and HS minus. So, basically reduced sulfur fractions are produced, and further from this reduced sulfur H2S, when bacterial oxidation occurs, they produce sulphate. Okay. From this reduced sulfur that is H2S, then it can convert to the it can volatilize and goes to the it can be volatilized, or it can produce the mineral formation. Now, this volatilized form of sulfur or H2S gas can produce the atmospheric sulfur, and this atmospheric sulfur further is absorbed by as a sulfur dioxide gas by the plant. So, this is how sulfur moves to the soil. Now, here this green like elemental sulfur, atmospheric sulfur, elemental sulfur, reduced sulfur, sulphate, adsorbed or mineral sulfur, non-organic sulfur are basically showing the components, and these green boxes and these blue boxes like atmospheric deposition, animal manures, plant residues, mineral fertilizer, weathering are basically showing the different inputs of the soil. So, you can see these are basically inputs from the in terms of mineral fertilizer, plant residues, animal manures, atmospheric deposition and weathering, and losses are basically denoted by these orange boxes. So, basically you can see the plant uptake, crop harvest, volatilization, runoff erosion, leaching and mineral formation, these are different losses of sulfur in the soil sulfur cycle. So, another important element which creates the soil pollution is called chloride. Now, chloride can be easily found in the soil water, but it becomes a pollutant when added to the soil system under uncontrolled management. As you can see, due to the application of saline irrigation water, there is a salt deposition on the surface, and most of the cases the soil is sodium chloride, which is a common salt. Now, the origin of this chloride in the soil is basically dissolution of chloride crystals and the deposition of the chloride, and then irrigation with saline water, as you can see here, and finally, the rise of chlorotic groundwater due to the poor drainage. So, when there is a poor drainage and high evaporative demand, obviously there will be a movement of these chlorotic groundwater to the surface, and then further evaporate, these water get evaporated, leaving the salt over the soil surface, producing the surface salinity. Now, chlorine is negatively charged and can be easily absorbed by positively charged soil surface, positively charged soil surface or oxides, hydroxides. Now, let us talk about magnesium. Magnesium is the fourth most abundant mineral in the living organisms, and it is present in the exchangeable cations from 0.5 to 14 kg per centimole in the soil exchange complex, with magnesium saturation exchange capacity from 10 to 20%, and exchangeable magnesium usually 20 to 60% of the total magnesium. So, it remains as a solute in liquid phase, and soils in arid region have higher solute concentration in soil due to the lack of leaching. So, magnesium, just like calcium, can be found in higher quantity or higher concentration in the arid and semi-arid region where the evaporative demand is quite high, and the total magnesium content increases with increasing clay content in the soil, because soil contains the soil clay minerals which have the brucite or trioctahedral layer. Remember, this trioctahedral layer are basically occupied by magnesium ions. Now, soil contains 0.015 to 1.02% total magnesium. Now, magnesium minerals can be classified into three major fractions. One is soil clays, that is smectite, vermiculite, illite, etc. Then soluble magnesium minerals like dolomite, magnesium sulphate, etc., and then different anthropogenic sources like irrigation water. So, how magnesium fixation occurs? Now, fixation of magnesium depends on soil pH, and magnesium remain exchangeable below pH of 6, and magnesium becomes non-exchangeable above pH 6.5. So, it remains in the soil solution with other if other cations occupy the exchange site, specifically calcium. So, there is always competition between calcium magnesium to occupy in the exchange site. So, if the exchange site is occupied by calcium, then magnesium will not occupy the exchange site and remain into the soil solution. So, you can see the magnesium cycle here, you can see here magnesium in the soil solution, and this magnesium is susceptible to leaching, and also this magnesium gets converted to organic matter, and then this organic matter, from this organic matter, due to the mineralization process, the magnesium can further comes to the soil solution. When the crop residues, we apply the crop residues into the soil, then it can also move convert into organic matter, which can further produce the magnesium into the soil solution. Also, this magnesium can be present in the form of exchangeable magnesium. When we apply the mineral and organic fertilizer, that also increases the magnesium concentration in the soil. Okay. And also magnesium get lost due to the harvest of the crop, which uptake the magnesium. Now, in the soil also you can see erosion occurs due to the runoff process, and also from the primary minerals primary minerals magnesium converted to the secondary minerals, and from the secondary minerals they can form in the non exchangeable magnesium, and these magnesium primary minerals can contribute directly to the magnesium in soil solution, and also from magnesium in soil solution and secondary minerals are basically in equilibrium to each other, and similar thing occurs between the magnesium in soil solution and non exchangeable magnesium. So, this is how magnesium basically rotates in the soil. So, it is basically showing the dynamics of magnesium in the soil. So, again, when the exchange complex is occupied by calcium, magnesium comes into the soil solution. Let us talk about the sodium. The importance of sodium mineral in soil is basically in the form of sodium chloride. It is highly soluble and quickly removed from the soil after heavy rainfall and irrigation with good drainage water. So, since it is highly mobile, when we apply good quality irrigation water, it is easily removed from the soil, and also due to the heavy rainfall, it is also can leach away or it can move away with the flowing water. But if the accumulation is greater than leaching, that is greater than 15% of sodium in the exchange complex, then sodium can replace other cations like calcium magnesium. Now, remember, in case of calcium magnesium, they decrease the zeta potential. When they decrease the zeta potential, they increase the chances of flocculation. When they increase the chances of flocculation, there is a more chance of getting more aggregated soil. However, when we apply sodium, or when the exchangeable sodium percentage goes beyond 15%, that basically replace the calcium magnesium from the exchange site. As a result of that, there is a considerable increase in the zeta potential. When the zeta potential increase, obviously the soil will be dispersed. So, when the soil will be dispersed, that will be causing a major disruption in the hydrophysical process, because the pores will be clogged, and as a result of that there will be no aggregate formation. So, pores will be clogged, and as a result surface crusting and all the other non-favorable condition as far as the soil hydrophysical properties are concerned will be there. So, this sodium is detrimental for the soil physical properties. It completely destroys the soil structure, as just I have told you how it destroys the soil structure. It increases the zeta potential. When it increases the zeta potential, there is there is no aggregate formation. The flocculation will be there will be no flocculation, no aggregate formation. Soil will be dispersed, and as a result there will be destruction of the soil structure. The accumulation of sodium takes place when the soil are irrigated with saline water, and high sodium concentration in the soil water can be toxic for many the agricultural crops. Now, sodium carbonate formation in the soil, there are two different processes. One is the physiochemical process and another is biological process. Now, in the physiochemical process, leaching with highly sodic water, then again leaching with water with low salinity. So, sodium carbonate happens in that way. And also weathering of igneous rocks, and also evaporation and then precipitation of carbonates like calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, when they convert to sodium carbonate, that is one of the way of sodium carbonate formation. And biologically sodium carbonate can be formed in soil as a result of reduction process. Now, if we see the sodium carbonate forms which are associated with alkali soils, there are three main types. One is the sodium bicarbonate, that is called nacolite, and then sodium carbonate 10H2O, that is called soda, and then trona, which is sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate and 2H2O. So, if you see the sodium cycle in the soil, this is the sodium cycle in the soil. So, basically in the soil solution sodium is present and the salt accumulation occurs due to the evaporation. When from the soil solution water gets evaporated, the evaporation occurs and vice versa. Okay. So, these sodium in the soil solution get easily removed by leaching in the ground and goes ultimately to the groundwater, and also when there is a high evaporative demand, then the groundwater can show capillary movement and ultimately the sodium moves to the soil solution. Also, oil industry brine can produce considerable amount of sodium in the soil solution and groundwater. And also from sodium bearing rocks also they produce huge amount of sodium into the groundwater. Okay. And this sodium occupies a certain percentage of the CEC or cationation capacity, since it is positively charged, and also it can be immobilized to organic matter and further comes back to the soil solution through the mineralization process. These plants, animals and sodium, these plants and animals basically, animals basically eat plants, and both animals and plants basically contribute to the formation of organic matter. And also when you apply sodium fertilizer, then that sodium also goes to the organic matter. So, this is how the sodium moves in the plant, animals and the soil. Also you can see from the soil solution, when there is an atmospheric sodium, when due to the precipitation process they basically reach to the soil solution. And this atmospheric precipitation also produce the surface water, saline surface water. This saline surface water can also evaporate to produce the evaporate to the atmosphere. Now, the parent material can be weathered to produce the secondary soil minerals, we know that, and from this secondary soil minerals also sodium can come to the soil solution. Also it produces losses to the parent material. So, this is the sodium cycle and it basically shows, and one more thing, that capillary movement and seepage can occurs from surface water to the groundwater and vice versa. So, this is basically sodium soil cycle in the soil, and this is how when the sodium concentration increases in the exchange complex, it creates the unfavorable condition for the soil. Now, potentially toxic trace elements. What are the potentially toxic trace elements? Adriano in 1986 defined trace elements as those elements that occur in the natural and perturbed system in small amounts and that when present in sufficient concentration are toxic to living organisms. Now, it is admitted that the inputs from the anthropogenic sources exceed the contribution from the natural sources. Although these trace elements can be originate from different natural sources, the anthropogenic sources are the major contributor of this trace element and ultimately creating them toxic. Now, human activity is primarily responsible for increasing the chances of trace metal concentration in the soils. Now, what are the anthropogenic sources? When you talk about the potentially toxic trace metals like arsenic, then lead, then cadmium, chromium, these are all potentially toxic trace elements. So, how these potentially toxic trace elements occur in the soil due to different anthropogenic processes? So, these anthropogenic processes are application of fertilizers specific for phosphatic fertilizer, and this fertilizer contains different types of these trace elements. So, when you apply the fertilizer into the soil, these trace elements also comes into the soil. Second is application of different chemicals used in soil reclamation. So, we apply different types of chemicals into the soil reclamation, and when we apply these chemicals for soil reclamation, that also creates the high concentration of toxic elements. Different organic biocides. Pesticide is one of the major source of these toxic trace elements. Pesticide contains these toxic trace elements, and when we apply the pesticides into the soil, they remain into the soil, they are persistent in nature, those remain in the soil, and simultaneously these organic toxic trace elements also remain in the soil. Mining residues, one of the major one of the major contributor of these trace elements. Automobile emission products, huge amount of these toxic elements are emitted due to the automobile emission and ultimately deposited in the soil surface. Municipal soils and then sewage and sludges. So, these are all examples of what different anthropogenics, and remember that these are all anthropogenic sources, because for all these the human activities are involved, human activities are responsible. So, these are the anthropogenic activities, and they basically create these toxic trace elements. Okay. So, the general metal cycle, if you see the general metal cycle, obviously due to the industrial process, you can see the heavy metals is moving. These yellow is basically, yellow shade is basically showing the heavy metals which are coming from different industrial processes, different agricultural processes, fertilizer corrosion you can see, and ultimately reaching different water body, and also from mining industries also. Okay. So, and also sediment is coming from different urban lands and different agricultural lands due to the runoff, and ultimately reaching into the water body. Okay. So, when it reaches into the water body, there is biological and chemical transformation occurs in the heavy metals, all right, and also these sediments get settled in the they basically get settled or further goes to the resuspension, and these elements ultimately stored in the stream bed, as you can see here. Sometime these elements which are getting stored in the stream bed get volatilized. Okay. So, this is how these trace metals basically move in the soil water in the soil water continuum. Okay. So, what are the different effects of trace elements on plant and animals? So, this shows different list, this shows the list of different trace elements and their essentiality for essentially beneficial nature of the for plants and animals, potential toxicity to the plants and animals, and their several features. So, for example, let us talk about the elements silver. So, silver has no essential or beneficial, they are not beneficial to plants and animals, however, they are toxic to animals. So, because they they basically interact with copper and selenium. So, if we talk about, for example, arsenic, arsenic is not toxic to the plant, however, it is toxic to the animal, and it shows the I am sorry, it is essential, it is not essential to the plant, but it is essential to the animals, and also it produces a potential toxicity for both plants and animals. So, it basically phytotoxic before animal toxicity and maybe also carcinogenic. So, long term accumulation of arsenic in our body shows different different types of cancers. Let us talk about cadmium. Cadmium is not useful for both plant and animal. However, they are showing the potential toxicity, they show potential, they are potentially toxic in nature, as you can see here. So, for both plants and animals, they are narrow margin, they can enrich in the food chain, they are carcinogenic and produce itai disease. Okay. So, let us see another important toxic element like chromium. Chromium is toxic to the plant. Okay. Similarly, lead is very much toxic to the both plant and animals, and basically aerial dispersion on primarily surface deposited cumulative poison. Okay. So, we can see the comments. So, similarly, mercury, it is a highly toxic for the animals. Okay. It enrich in the foods and aquatic accumulation, and it produces the Minamata disease. So, you can see the trace elements produce huge amount of potential pollution for both plants and animals, and that is why they are very important to their discussion is very much important when you are talking about soil pollutants. Now, different trace elements according to Adriano in 1986, the potentially toxic micronutrients, as far as the micronutrients are concerned, the potentially toxic plant micronutrients are zinc, manganese, copper, iron, molybdenum and boron, and others are arsenic, then chromium and cadmium. So, the radioactive trace elements are dangerous for the environment. Okay. We have seen some radioactive trace elements, you can see here there are some radioactive trace elements like cobalt is a radioactive, we can see here lead is a radioactive trace elements. Okay. So, this is very potential toxic to the animal body. So, these radioactive trace elements are dangerous for the environment. Radioactive elements generally reach the soil accidentally following an unsafe disposal, and their behavior are also similar to other non-radioactive elements. So, let us start with the arsenic. Now, arsenic basically comes from group 5A of periodic table. It has an atomic weight of 674.992. It has the common oxidation states are either 0, 3 and 5. However, this arsenic 3 oxidation state is more toxic than arsenic 5. Forms basically found as bound covalently with most metals and stable organic compounds, and sources are soil parent material. So, it is naturally occurring one of the, so this arsenic is basically naturally occurring. However, from the anthropogenic sources also landfill waste, airborne emission also creates the arsenic. Okay. Arsenic in the environment in uncontaminated soil, the total arsenic in general does not exceed 20 ppm and stays as insoluble compounds with aluminum, iron and calcium, and the water soluble fraction can reach about 6% of the total arsenic in solution in soil as sodium arsenite As3 plus, so sodium arsenite, and the reduced form of arsenic, that is arsenic 3, is 4 to 10 times more soluble in water than oxidized state, that is arsenate. In a strongly reducing soil environment, element arsenic and arsine gas can exist. So, arsine gas is a gas of arsenic. In an anaerobic environment, obviously arsenate is stable, and arsenite can be predominant form under moderately reducing condition created by flooding. And this arsenite, again I am telling, this arsenite is more toxic than arsenate. So, friends, we have talked about some important trace element, we have talked about some important trace element, we have started discussing them with the arsenic, and let us wrap up our lecture here, and let us continue this, and let us discuss the other important trace elements in details in our coming lecture, and also we will be seeing other important organic pollutants for soil and their different ill effects or pollution ill effects in different soil physiochemical and biological properties. Thank you very much.